4 things you can try if you have knee pain while you're cycling. Knees don't really like instability. When you're cycling, instability can creep in from below, so think the wrong foot, shoe or cleat position, or above, think instability in your pelvis or the wrong saddle position or the wrong saddle itself. There's almost an unlimited number of variables that you can think about when you're trying to work out what individual step-by-step thing you can try and do to work your knee pain out when you're cycling. The thing is though, if you work through these 4 steps, or at least approach the problem with these 4 things in mind, you should be able to start getting somewhere with this problem. So the first thing is your foot. The foot is a very complex part of your body. There's loads of articulations and there's loads of avenues for instability, stiffness, or things that might not be right with your foot or its position on your bike that can knock on up the chain a little bit, start causing you problems down the front of your knee, inside of your knee, the top of your knee. So the first thing I'm going to get you to think about is making sure that your shoe size fits individually. And I've done a bit of a deep dive on foot pain and cycling in a previous video, which I'll link up, and you can have a look there and see a little bit more detail as to how I would fit a shoe. But first things first, if your shoe is too long or it's too short, if it's too long, first of all, the cleat position is going to drive your foot into a high angle. And if it's too short and tight, it's going to squeeze your foot, causing your ankle to go into a high angle. The knock-on effect here is it puts your knee into a high position. So when you push, there's going to be more tension down the front of your knee. And it's going to put your hip into a higher position. So not only is your knee more tensioned, your hip's in a less stable place for you to push down into and generate power through your leg. A good first step to start stabilizing your foot inside the shoe would be making sure that the size of your shoe is appropriate. So again, that basic thing that I tell people to do all the time, put the insole of the shoe on the floor, stand on the insole, and have a look and see if your foot is a close match to the footprint of the insole itself. That'll tell you about 90% of the things you need to know if your foot's working in the shoes that you have or not. Following on from there, putting your cleat as far back as possible on that shoe is going to give your toes a little bit more leverage on the ankle because you're moving your foot forward. And if your toes have more control of the ankle, it's just going to give you more control in general about what your foot's doing in the cycling shoe. But that's just one element of this. The next thing I want you to think about is, do you have any correction inside of your shoes? The reason correction is so important is because of a few different things. First of all, the correction itself proprioceptively gives you a part of your foot you can push into when you're cycling. The second thing it does is it aligns the ankle with the bottom of your shin so that your foot can articulate over your shin nicely. The other thing that it does is it can correct for any forefoot pathology. So for instance, if you've got a dropped first toe, or if you have a lot of varus or valgus of your forefoot, for instance, basically all I'm saying is if your foot's a funny shape, a specialist custom insole can make a very big difference as to your comfort in your shoe. But the reason why that's important for knee pain is quite often if there's pain, it generally causes people to start pushing with a funny pattern into their foot, and that in itself can be enough to cause a problem. But if you don't like pushing with your whole foot into the shoe, say you've got pain in your big toe and you start pushing into the outside of your foot, that's just going to make your foot roll out the way, push your knee into a high angle and start causing you problems down the outside of your knee. That's just one hypothetical example of where you can start to go wrong. The key thing is though, if you push into your entire foot, then generally that's the most stable thing to do when you're cycling. And that's going to help your knee, because if you're pushing into your whole foot, you're pushing into the most stable platform that you possibly can. The next thing you can do to start working out if your foot is potentially causing a problem in your knee when you're cycling is just to simply stand on one foot, close your eyes and see how well you can balance, and you can even record and see how much your foot moves when you're standing there. Now, when you put a cycling shoe on your foot and stand up, you lose a lot of awareness about where your foot is in space. So generally, what I see is the first thing that happens is someone For instance, if someone's foot's gonna kind of collapse a little bit when they're standing on 2 feet, as soon as they put their foot inside a cycling shoe, their foot just flops on that hard surface and that smooth surface, and it just drops in. Now, this is a problem because if your arch is collapsing when you push into your foot, then that's going to generally cause a couple of different things. So the first thing it might cause is an internal rotation in the shin. The second thing that it might cause is you to avoid any such internal rotation by doing something as simple as dropping your toes down into a high angle. So it's going to cause a problem both ways. If there's no correction under the shoe and your ankle rolls in and internally rotates your tibia, that's going to cause a torquing underneath your knee. If you try and avoid that by putting your foot into a high angle, it's going to bring your knee up into a high position, again causing more tension down the front of your knee and also putting your hip into a higher position, causing instability up at the saddle, which can then work its way back down. So fundamentally, getting your foot into the right position by making sure the shoe's correct, making sure the cleat is in a stable position, and making sure you've got foot correction inside the shoe is a strong starting point. And if you don't want to go down the road of spending hundreds and hundreds of pounds or dollars or whatever on a custom insole, you can start with something relatively cheap. So Superfeet Carbon is a relatively inexpensive insole that I recommend to quite a lot of people just getting into this. And it essentially helps most people align the ankle relative to the shin and gives a proprioceptive place for you to push into with your arch into your cycling shoe. And that in itself is the first level of getting a stable position that you can push into and cause you the least amount of problems. So that's number one. We've had a look at something underneath the knee. Let's have a think about how things above the knee can cause problems. So the obvious thing here is the stability of the pelvis. Now, an unstable pelvis can cause problems in the knee because of a few reasons. Most people that I work with in the fit studio, when they stand on their right foot, their right hip drops, and as soon as they stand on their right foot, their right hip drops down the way. And the reason that's a problem is because all of a sudden the pelvis is lower on one side than the other. So that creates essentially this torsion or this twisting. So if your hip drops when you're standing off the bike, what do you think is going to happen when you push hard into that foot when you're sitting on a bike? Especially when you're not exactly sitting on the most stable surface anyway, thinking like a small saddle. Of course, that right hip's going to drop. Now, every time you push into that right foot, if that right hip is dropping down and forwards, that's going to be causing a lot of back and forward on the saddle. So this is something that might contribute to saddle pain, which is potentially a video I'm going to be making later. But from like the knee's point of view, if your hip is dropping down and forward and let's say there's also a challenge underneath the knee, it's just another thing that might cause that knee to start rotating internally. Because if my pelvis, so all of a sudden my pelvis is dropping down and forward with every pedal stroke, it's going to put more pressure down the front of my leg because it's going to move my pelvis further towards the bottom bracket in like a horizontal sense. So the further back my pelvis is from the saddle, the more and more engagement I'm going to get in the posterior chain and glutes. But the good thing about that is that contributes to stability. But if every time I push the pedal, I don't have enough strength in my glutes to stop my pelvis dropping forward with my leg, then you're always going to find this little bit of twisting forward gradually with every pedal stroke that you make. The downside to that is all of a sudden it's going to start causing problems with fatigue and tension down the front of your leg because you're just moving with that pedal stroke all the time, and your quad and your anterior chain is going to start tensioning up because there's less and less space there, and there's more and more activation in there all the time because there's not enough activation in the back of my leg because my hip's too far forward on that side to support it. The next thing that's going to happen is as I push down, say my foot is causing me an instability problem, I need my glute to be strong because it's going to stop my femur from rotating in towards the midline of the bike. So effectively, we need your pelvis to be strong from its own sense. So as I push the pedal, I want my pelvis to resist dropping forward with my leg when I push down. I also want my pelvis to be strong enough to challenge any instability coming from underneath the knee, because as my foot rolls in, the next thing that's going to happen is my tibia will roll internally, and then because my femur sits above it, of course, my femur is going to be rolling internally as well. So this is kind of the person that you sit behind on a ride whose right leg looks like a karate chop every pedal stroke, or their left leg. More commonly, I find actually that the right side is the side that drops forward and in on more people than the left. And the reason for that is simply most people who are right-handed generally, so that is most people, generally are stronger on their left side, more mobile on the right. And often that asymmetry is enough for that right side to become the one that is more susceptible to rolling down and forward and into the bike, causing more problems on that side. But that's just a generalization. It's not everyone, and it might not be you. But stable pelvis and a strong glute is your best friend when avoiding knee pain. The other contributor to pelvic stability is most people's saddles don't give them the chance to load their pelvis properly. So all I mean by this is I see a lot of people, especially on these short triangular saddles, think like a Specialized Power, for instance, most people don't sit properly on those saddles because there's not enough real estate for them to be able to roll forwards and get themselves supported in the right position. Most people on these saddles scoot their bum forward and roll back, putting themselves into a bad position, rolling their pelvis into a bad position, locking their posterior chain out of the equation and making their quads do all the work. Now, the next thing that's going to contribute to the stability of the pelvis is obviously the choice of saddle. So another example in this case would be if you're using the wrong saddle for your position or for your abilities, then it's going to contribute somewhat overly so to the instability or the stability as such of a pelvis itself. So this, just give you an example and a work through, and this is what I find influences most people's poor saddle posture. Simply the waist and the shoulder of the saddles and how that then causes you to move into the wrong position. So let's have a look at that. This long saddle and this triangular short style saddle are two very different products. Now, most people I see that come into the bike fit studio with a saddle similar to this very aggressively flared, very curved shoulder, very short waisted saddle, often slide forward and roll backwards when they're sitting on the bike on this seat. Now that creates a lot of avenues for instability. So the first thing that's going to do, if you move your hips forward, that's going to stop the posterior chain being as active, which itself may cause instability. The next thing that's going to happen is you basically shorten the short waist of the saddle even more, which means there's no real estate. You're going to be loading on the smallest possible bit of the saddle, literally rocking back and forward between two very small points. Now that rocking side to side and back and forward on already a small saddle with a lot of curve onto it basically means that you're essentially creating your own wobble board. Your pelvis will be moving around so much with every pedal stroke that you're not really going to be giving the muscles any chance to stabilize your leg. So if your glutes weak and your foot's causing you a problem, there's no way you're going to be able to brace your core on this saddle against the instability challenges from below. So it's really important that your pelvis is planted. Now, that's not saying these saddles are bad. All it's saying is if this is the sort of saddle that's on your bike, you better be able to lean forwards and engage your core, keeping your spine relatively neutral. If you can't anteriorly rotate your pelvis to load back to front on this style of saddle, then it's not for you. Trust me, you can get more than enough comfort even with a saddle that's this long if it's got an appropriate width, length of waist and amount of support in the waist. Now, a saddle like this I see hardly often in the bike fit studio until I introduce the concept of having a saddle that is long and supportive in the waist, square enough on the shoulders, so that if you're in an endurance position, this saddle's going to be there for you and support your pelvis as you sit on it. Again, short saddles like this aren't bad, but most people that have them either don't sit on them correctly or can't sit on them correctly. And this just drops nicely into the next part of this video, which is the awareness element. A lot of people are simply not aware that they are sitting in the wrong posture to start with. Now, a lot of people that I work with don't know how to drop forward on a saddle or lean forward on a saddle with a neutral spine. Now, this is a really important aspect because if you can't lean forward and rotate your pelvis in an anterior fashion on this saddle, you're never going to get it supporting you. It's simple. For instance, on a bike, if you're sitting on the saddle, sucking your tummy button in towards your tailbone and relaxing your lower back, the next thing you want to be doing is then relaxing into your shoulder blades. Just imagine you're trying to squeeze your shoulder blades gently together at the same time as relaxing your lower back and gently engaging your core. Now that might sound complicated, but if you try that when you're riding, what you'll find is your pelvis starts to roll forwards on the saddle. Posture is one of the main things that influences what muscles are being used when you're pushing on the pedals. And I see an awful lot of people sitting on a saddle like they're trying to sit on a chair at work, which often totally locks out the posterior chain and over-utilizes quads on the push stroke. So that in itself over-activates the quads on the push, which sucks if you're a knee, and at the same time, it effectively reduces their power output because they can't optimize the hamstrings and they can't get a really nice push into the foot. But more just because they don't know how they should sit. The other thing that I see in the Bigfoot studio is people pushing with their foot the wrong way. So if I just bring your awareness into pushing into your whole foot, I find myself a lot of the time telling people to imagine I chop their foot off halfway down the shin and just get them pushing into their whole foot against the shoe, as opposed to trying to push into any one part of their foot that might then lead the knee in or out or into a bad pattern. So what are the things that you can do to sit the right way? First of all, I want you to sit on your saddle, suck your tummy button towards your tailbone. So that's going to be the first step in engaging your pelvic floor and helping you get some stability around your pelvis. Next, relax your lower spine, and that'll help you lean forwards on the saddle. And what you should feel at this point is your pelvis rolling, and you should feel like there's support from back to front along the length of the seat. You should feel the bony tissue either side the top of your leg engaging with the top of the saddle. Now I want you to just keep that same part of the pelvis engaged on the top of the saddle, slide back and forward and find a supportive place for you. Next, I want you just to engage your shoulder blades. So rather than pushing against the bars, I want you to sink into your shoulders so that your upper arm bone is relaxed, nice and neutral into your shoulder socket. And that way, we've got an engaged pelvic floor, we've got a neutral spine, and a pelvis that's rolled anteriorly on this saddle. Now just relax around that, so you can switch it all off again and just start to build your pedal stroke up. And as long as you feel like you're not overloading soft tissue at the front, it shouldn't feel like you're trying to stick your back out behind you or tuck your tummy button in underneath you. It should just feel like you're nice and relaxed and nice and neutral. Now that's one of the biggest things when it comes to just your all-round posture, just that awareness of pushing into your foot correctly and being aware of the posture that you're in and how that can possibly influence what muscles that you're using. Because if you're overusing or underusing the right muscles,
Yes.
all down to posture or pushing incorrectly, and that's causing your knee pain, well, you can sort it out very quickly just by sitting the right way. Next, and finally, the position element. If your foot's in the right place and it's in the right shoe and your cleats in the right position and your pelvis is fully supported with a saddle that's got a long supportive waist and you're aware of pushing the pedals correctly and you're sitting in the right postures, I could generally put your saddle a little bit on the high side or a little bit on the low side and you'd probably not have many problems. And I guess this fundamental final part of the whole thing is that the position element is the last thing I'll mention because there's no point having something in the right position unless the fundamentals of your foot, pelvis, and awareness of where it all is totally out of kilter. So finally, the position of the saddle's the thing that ties everything together. So there's a few ways that you can work out the right position of the saddle for you. A nice basic one I do is get people to close their eyes, pedal backwards on the pedal stroke, and they're just looking out. You'll know your saddle's too high if you can relax your heels, pedal backwards, and feel that there's a massive jumping dead spot through the bottom of the saddle. And you can, by and large, get the saddle height approximate if you're willing to just lean forward, lean back, because the main thing that you're looking for is control. If you can't control the bottom of the pedal stroke, then what's the point in having the saddle at a height that's bringing your foot through a part that you can't control? It's just going to drive a bad posture or a bad pattern that's going to ultimately lead to pain or discomfort, or at least a lack of efficiency. So working that excess height out of the equation by the back pedaling feedback loop, that's one of the most effective things that I use all the time. Saddle being too low, well, that's another thing we can do. So back pedaling is really handy because it also highlights big jumpy dead spots over the top of the pedal stroke. The downside here is it's not as simple. If the crank's too long or if the saddle is too far back, then you're going to have excessive lumpiness over the top of the pedal stroke that way. Another way that'll come up is if the bar position is too low. The saddle being too low is another driver of knee pain. And trust me, it's not as simple as to jump on a bike and work out what knee angle everything is and then you know you're fine. The saddle being too low is another driver of knee pain for a couple of reasons. The saddle is so low that you can't extend the knee enough that the quad can't get anywhere close to its resting length. The quad's not going to be able to relax enough in the recovery phase, so you're just going to end up feeling like your quads are really puffy and essentially swollen up as soon as you start pushing harder on the pedals. That's a sign itself that the saddle could be too low. The other thing is excessive lumpiness over the top of the pedal stroke. Now, it's not quite as simple as this, but it's a good starting point for saddle height. If you do the back pedaling and you feel like there's big lumpy dead spots over the top of the pedal stroke, then that's another sign that the saddle can be too low. So you can get the saddle to a position where you feel like there's a good compromise between a minimum amount of knocking over the top of the pedal stroke and the maximum amount of control through the bottom of the pedal stroke. But other influencers here can be things like a crank that is too long. Again, a shoe that is too big can make all of this knocky dead spots over the top of the pedal stroke or lack of control through the bottom essentially be more highlighted or easier to feel. So there you go. That is my 4 pillars of thought process when it comes to working out how I'm going to sort out someone's knee pain. Of course, it's never this simple, but if you think about all of these things in combination when you're assessing your own knee pain on a bike, then at the very least, this will give you some context as to how a bike fitter near you might start following a thought process around trying to fix it. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful. If there's any questions that you have, then please put them in the comment section and I'll try and answer them as best I can. Thanks very much for watching. And by the way, if you want a bike fit at Edinburgh Bike Fitting, then please follow the link at the bottom of the page and book here.